The government has come under increasing pressure to be open over recent years. It hasn't always responded to that as generously as it might. And I mean, the fact is that where policies are contentious, it's always a battle to get the information. There's too many potential exemptions and justifications that government can give for withholding information, and it can be a bit of a battle to challenge them. Over the last 10 years or so, there's been a big move towards commercialising the provision of public services. So areas where these concerns weren't factors at all are now partly, or sometimes more than partly, protected by arguments of commercial confidentiality. And the thing is that whenever there's a commercial transaction, either the public authority or the contractor or both tend to say it's commercially harmful to tell you what's going on. And sometimes that's simply because they don't understand what is actually harmful to disclose. And when they see a pound sign, they get alarmed and think they better withhold whatever follows the pound sign. In the Freedom of Information Act, there's a whole series of exemptions, about 22 exemptions. The ones that most obviously come up, well, it depends what area you're looking at. In government policy making, there's an exemption for the formulation of government policy. That's subject to a test of whether the public interest in disclosing is at least as great as the public interest in withholding it. So in a lot of these areas, the information has to be disclosed, even if it's exempt, if on balance the public interest is in favour of disclosure. So that's the good thing about the Act. It's a two-way process. It doesn't just look at, can the government show disclosure would harm some commercial interest? It also has to look at whether the public interest justifies keeping that information confidential. And that means that if there are concerns about safety, value for money, propriety, fair competition, and so on, people may be able to get information on public interest grounds, which otherwise would be withheld. One of the areas that information is withheld is to protect the policy-making process. So that's one potential block. Another is to protect personal information. And that tends to cover the names of officials who are involved in decisions. So depending on how senior they are, the more senior they are, the more likely it is their names will have to be disclosed. So it tends to protect middle-ranking or junior people. Then there's protections for legal advice. But a significant protection is for information which could prejudice the commercial interests of the public authority or some other person, some company, or for information whose disclosure would be a breach of confidence at common law. And so between the two of those, that potentially covers a lot of information about commercial transactions involving public authorities. And over the last 10 years or so, there's been a big move towards commercialising the provision of public services. So areas where these concerns weren't factors at all are now partly, or sometimes more than partly, protected by arguments of commercial confidentiality. People who want to challenge that can go to the Information Commissioner and say why they think commercial confidentiality argument doesn't stand up. But really at that stage, the onus is on the public authority to justify withholding the information. The authority has to persuade the Commissioner that they are entitled to withhold it because disclosure would be harmful and would not be in the public interest. But it makes a difference if the person who's after the information understands the arguments that are being put forward and puts themselves in a position to be able to challenge them. But the critical thing is that what the exemption attempts to protect is information which would genuinely weaken the authority's ability to get a good deal for public money, or a commercial body's ability to compete fairly with other companies and not have the information that would help, that it has worked out for itself, shared with its competitors so they can benefit from the work that it has done. And one of the things the Commissioner will usually ask the authority to demonstrate is that there is actually competition taking place. So you can't, an authority usually can't get away with protecting information on grounds of commercial harm if there isn't actually competition taking place. And that might be because there's actually only one supplier dominates the whole marketplace, or because the information relates to a contract or a commercial transaction, which is so different from any contract that's about to come up or any transaction that's about to come up, that you cannot demonstrate how the commercial body concerned would be harmed by disclosing that information to a competitor. So, for example, a few years ago, somebody was trying to find out the costs that the London Borough of Newham had charged to the BBC for the use of a tower block to film the Olympics from. Newham said, if we disclose this information, it will undermine our ability to get the best price from the next TV or other body that wants to come in and take that tower block to film a big sporting event. So there were two objections, it turns out, to that. The first was the tower block was going to be demolished in a few years' time. So that argument had a very short lifespan. And the second was there was no conceivable event comparable to the Olympics coming up. And the factors that would have led to one price being agreed for the Olympics would not apply to the much smaller events that might come up there. And so the Commissioner said there's no competition here. The information's got to be disclosed. If you know, broadly speaking, how much money's been spent, you know what you're supposed to be getting for that. You know what penalties the contract imposes for failing to deliver the right product or deliver it to the right service or on time, so that you know that if the contractor falls down, the public's money is protected. They're not going to benefit from the contract, even if they don't actually provide anything. So there are a lot of cases where that type of factor comes in, and we had cases where contractors with contracts to tag offenders were actually being paid for tagging people who had died or had been returned to prison, and they were still claiming their fee for doing that. And that was revealed, although sometimes that's revealed as a result of a whistleblower or very penetrating inquiry by somebody. But disclosures under the Freedom of Information Act can contribute to revealing those types of things and make some contribution to keeping this type of public spending under scrutiny, and not just allow the whole thing to disappear into a commercial transaction where the public have got no rights to know anything. It is difficult for them to get away with a blanket secrecy. And I mean, it was very interesting that I think one of the first big PFI hospitals in Scotland were asked under the Scottish Freedom of Information Act for the disclosure of the contract. The health body simply said it's all commercially confidential. And when the Scottish Information Commissioner asked them to set out what information was confidential and how it would cause harm if it disclosed, they just didn't answer. And they obviously couldn't answer. And the Commissioner repeatedly asked them for it, and they repeatedly failed. And he just said, well, they've failed to persuade me that they were entitled to withhold the information. The whole contract has to be disclosed. And a gigantic contract was disclosed because the authority hadn't begun to properly justify withholding any of it, and the onus is on the authority to demonstrate the withholding is legitimate. I mean, the PFI contracts, because of the way they're set up, create additional problems over and above the ordinary type of contracts for the provision of services that exist in the NHS and which all public authorities enter into. So they can make it even more difficult to get hold of information, sometimes for the whole life of the contract, for 25 or 30 years. It may be that nobody thought about this at the time, and the more time that's passed since the contract was negotiated, the less relevant any of the figures, even the specific figures, are to a future commercial transaction, because the price you paid for something 10 years ago under completely different economic conditions and financial conditions are probably not a good indicator to anyone of what the price would be today. We've, for several years, been trying to promote a private member's bill that would ensure that all information which a contractor held about a public service contract was subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so that you never had the situation of public authorities saying, we can't give you that information, we can't even consider whether you're entitled to it, because it's held by the contractor for the contractor's own purposes and not on our behalf. And so what the bill says is any information which a contractor holds about the delivery of a public service under contract is held on the authority's behalf. Any contract that exists is going to have read into it a clause to that effect if the bill becomes law automatically. And what that means is that the test will always be, is it harmful and against the public interest to disclose this information? You always get straight to the question of whether it's harmful or beneficial to disclose the information. You will not have to negotiate the issue of whether the information is held on behalf of the public authority or by the contractor for the contractor's own reasons, in which case it's out of the question that you would get it under FOIA. We're trying to remove that question from the table altogether. The other thing the bill would do is bring housing associations under the Freedom of Information Act, because at the moment, housing associations in Northern Ireland and in Scotland are judged to be public authorities under the Scottish Freedom of Information Act, and even under and in case of Northern Ireland bodies, under the UK Act. But those bodies in England and Wales, housing associations in England and Wales, are not judged to be public authorities, because the legislation that they operate under gives them different powers, doesn't give them the same powers and responsibilities as the bodies in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and so they don't hit the necessary definition. So this is one of the problems in which you have, obscure differences in drafting either give or remove people's right to information in ways that nobody had anticipated at the time. So we hope that private members bill is going to help overcome both of those problems. If people want to support it, they can write to their members of parliament, particularly in 2018, asking them to support the bill which Andy Slaughter is introducing about private sector contractors and housing associations. And the more MPs feel that this measure is supported by the public, the more the bill's chances of becoming law will be strengthened.